What is really happening inside Europe's latest peace proposal? Why are discussions around Ukraine now touching not only on security guarantees and political arrangements, but even on the possible return of Russia to the G8? And most importantly, what does this tell us about how the European Union sees the future balance of power on the continent? These questions suddenly became central after new documents emerged from European diplomatic circles. According to information reviewed by several international outlets, the European plan contains a surprising provision, a willingness to invite Russia back into the G8 after a final settlement of the conflict. For many observers, this raises more questions than answers. Why would Europe include such an offer right now? Why does this appear in the European draft but not in the American one? And how does this align with public statements from various G7 leaders? To understand this shift, we need to place it in a wider context. Europe's economic pressures, concerns about long-term security, diverging views between the EU and Washington, and ongoing debates about how to build a stable post-conflict framework for Eastern Europe. This development doesn't automatically mean a quick breakthrough, far from it. But it does show how deeply Europe is rethinking its role, its strategy, and its relationship with both Moscow and Washington. What follows is a detailed breakdown of how the two plans differ, what each side wants, and what these proposals could mean for the months ahead. The European document reviewed by media outlets contains several key ideas that differ noticeably from the American draft. One of the most discussed elements is the suggestion that Russia could be invited to rejoin the G8 after a long-term settlement is reached. This point stands in contrast to statements made just days earlier by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who noted that most G7 members are not ready to cooperate with Russia within that format. However, the European document frames this potential step as a long-term objective, to be considered after all other terms of the settlement are fulfilled. European officials appear to be exploring ways to stabilize relations and avoid long-term division on the continent. This includes softer language on sanctions, approaches to economic reintegration, and mechanisms for dialogue. Recent leaks show meaningful gaps between the two drafts. The U.S. plan includes strict limitations and specific commitments from Ukraine and Russia, while the EU version focuses on a broader framework involving NATO and long-term regional mechanisms. The EU specifies that NATO forces would not be deployed in Ukraine during peacetime, while the U.S. document does not emphasize this condition. The American plan proposes reforms and clear commitments from Kyiv, including constitutional guarantees. The EU draft avoids detailed political conditions and uses more flexible language. The European proposal suggests gradual easing of sanctions and joint work on reintegration into global markets. The U.S. plan mentions full lifting of sanctions and includes economic arrangements involving frozen assets. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov reiterated that Russia remains open to discussions but has not been formally approached with these new documents. President Vladimir Putin stated that the American plan could serve as a foundation in theory, but only after Kyiv and its partners adopt a realistic position. The White House notes that work on the U.S. proposal continues and that details remain undisclosed while consultations proceed. European policymakers appear concerned about long-term instability in Eastern Europe. The EU has economic exposure, energy concerns, and growing domestic debates over financial support for Kyiv. A settlement that restores predictability in relations with Moscow, even partially, is seen as beneficial by some European governments. However, others remain cautious, pointing to unresolved security issues and political disagreements within the EU itself. Analysts see several potential outcomes: a hybrid plan merging US and EU elements, a standalone European initiative if the US process stalls, a prolonged negotiation cycle involving multiple rounds of revisions, or a scenario where no agreement is reached if key stakeholders oppose compromises. The next steps will depend on political willingness, reactions from Kyiv, and alignment between Washington and European capitals.